I have the pleasure here to be with John Dawson, who is founder and president of Arcam. John, one of the things that our readers and viewers have the impression is compressed in music means it's bad, but maybe you can enlighten them a little bit. There's compressed and there are different forms of compression. So maybe we can give them a little bit of insight.
It's a can of worms, guys, but let me try to do a simple explanation of compression. There is what I might call artistic compression. That is where we balance the levels of audio signals, maybe of different instruments, so that they have the right kind of volume level that they can be heard satisfactorily together. That is applied in a recording studio and is at the discretion of the producer and the artist. Done well, that is a good thing. There's another form of compression that also applies to changing the levels of the signal, which is done at CD mastering, which I personally don't think is a good thing, which is where a producer says, but I want my record to be louder than the other guys when it plays on the radio. And what that means is that all the levels on the tracks of music are brought up to the maximum, ODB full scale as we call it in CD, and are butting against that level all the time the music is played. And that can be very tiring. It can at its worst be obnoxious. There is a Motorhead album that's famous for having everything within 1 dB of full scale. And I hope that dies away. There's certainly a move in the professional, purist side of the recording industry to try to minimize this fashion. Now, those are both artistic effects. Then there's another effect, which is trying to minimize the storage space in a system so that we can get more music into a given space or down a given pipe for broadcast. And that is called compression. Sloppily, we might want to call it data reduction. At its least obnoxious, you can do to an audio signal what is done to a computer file when you zip it. That is, you can study the music for patterns of repeatability and use an intelligent algorithm to remove some of the data but none of the signal. In other words, if there's a long period of silence, you can encode that in quite a small space. So that is a form we call lossless compression, and as far as I'm concerned, that is benign and, if done adequately or properly, is inaudible. That's a good thing, and that enables us to get DVD audio tracks into less space than we might otherwise do. Typically, you can reduce a CD track by 2 to 1, or a high-resolution track by 3 to 1 in terms of data, with no audible loss whatsoever. Beyond that is what the industry calls lossy compression. And this was evolved quite a few years ago when storage was expensive and transmission bandwidth was very expensive. We didn't have the space. One of the first systems was MPEG-1, used for DCC, digital compact cassette. And very soon after that, a form called MPEG-2 audio, which is used today on some forms of digital broadcast and occasionally on DVD. And in that, you can make a pretty good compression, perhaps 4 or 5 to 1, without obvious audible artifacts. MP3 is the successor to MP2. They're a logical hierarchy. And that was originally invented to use 2 ISDN telephone lines, each at 64 kilobits per second, to carry a reserve audio channel in case the FM or TV sound packed up. That's the real origin of MP3. It's a professional background. But that was adopted by the consumer and computer industry as a way of compressing music, typically to 128 kilobits per second, from an original of 1.4 megabits per second. So that's what, 10 or 12 to 1 in data. And I have to tell you guys, that's very audible. And there are artifacts which are not ones we're musically used to, which at the worst can be obnoxious and at the least slightly disconcerting and tiring. So when it comes to storing music on an iPod or a computer, if you can store it losslessly or in the original CD format or whatever, that's the best option. And disk space and flash space is a lot cheaper than it used to be. My iPod is full of Apple lossless compression, 2 to 1 compression, which works very well and is, for all intents and purposes, broadly inaudible. But if you're going to record in MP3 or AAC, which is a rather better codec, pick the highest data rate they've got on the system. For MP3, if you can record at 256 kilobits per second or higher, And if you can download at that rate, and some sites are now offering that rate for a 20-cent premium for a track, then do it, because in the long run, you've preserved it better. Same for AAC. Apple's default is 128 kilobits per second, and it's quite acceptable, but if you play it through a good hi-fi system or a quiet system with good headphones, again, you will hear some of the artifacts. At 256 kilobits per second, that will be a lot less obvious, and for most people, sound very close to the original. So it's very much a matter of using common sense, and the more resolution you can put into the original, just like a photograph, the better you can use it in the long term.
Oh, there's the other question is you can have it on a computer or a storage device, Apple lossless, but you get the most out of it. You use a DAC, and you sometimes use one DAC, two DACs. You're a specialist, Arcam's a specialist, and maybe give us a little bit insight. What does the DAC do, and what are the different formats?
A DAC means digital to analog converter, and is a piece of circuitry, usually a chip of silicon these days, which takes digits, pulse code modulation or whatever, and converts them to a smoothly varying audio signal that ideally is an accurate representation of what was first recorded. And DAC chips these days are all at least competent. They didn't used to be, but that isn't the whole story. The better ones do it better. And if you were to put an ADC and a DAC back to back, in other words, take your analog, convert it to a digital stream, stick it down a bit of wire and convert it back again, the very best ones are probably pretty much transparent. But if you put storage in the way, although that storage may be lossless, when you extract it again, you have to reconstruct the master clocks that run the DAC. And it turns out that the transport protocols often used to transmit audio, SPDIF or USB or Firewire, don't carry the master clock signals properly and normally have to be reinterpreted downstream at the DAC to get a clock to run the DAC. And they have timing errors. That is, each pulse doesn't come in at precisely the same time, it can move with time. And that variation could be white noise, which is benign, or it could be associated with the data itself, so it varies with the digital data, or it could be associated with power supplies or the filth that goes on inside, in RF terms, inside a computer motherboard. And frankly, all of those things can quite audibly degrade the sound. So when you're building a DAC, you've got to have a good master clock, and you've got to have a good way of pulling it off. And we were one of the first people on the planet to actually produce these kind of things in outboard modules in separate boxes where the environment was benign and the power supplies were good to try to do the job better. And we did that over 20 years ago, and we're now coming back into the market with wee boxes like this that take advantage of the modern technology available to us to extract what's on a computer hard drive or an iPod hard drive and reconstruct it as perfectly as the original data allows. And not all these devices are created equal, and it's important for customers to bear that in mind. For example, we use special electronics to de-jitter the incoming clock data and reconstruct it for the DAC chip as perfectly as possible. We do that for SPDIF with one piece of silicon, and we do it for USB with entirely another. We use something called asynchronous transfer protocol, a little noticed part of the USB spec and rarely used, which calls the data off the computer at the rate it's required by the DAC, rather than the computer forcing it into the DAC and forcing the DAC to try to make up its own guess of what the clock should be. And believe me, guys, it's audible. So these are the things we're trying to bring to the party, so that however you store your music, on flash drive or computer or on a shiny piece of plastic, that you can get the best possible results at the end. And I hope that gives a quick summary of what this kind of stuff is about.
Thank you very much for this opportunity and your insight and your experience.
Always a pleasure, Bob. I love coming to these things, and appreciate reader feedback. If there's anything we can do to make the stuff clearer, please let us know.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.